Welcome back to Proxam, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about something a little bit interesting, and that is something kind of outside of the regular game, which is playing Craftworld Eldar Mind Games. And we're going to be looking at the difference between playing the actual game with the rules and playing your opponent, which are actually, believe it or not, two completely different things, one of which is actually rooted in the rules, and one of which is rooted in basically figuring out your opponent and what your opponent is prone to do, the decisions they make and what they have fun doing, etc. Now, to give you a little bit of a background into this, mind games have been used throughout history by many a great general to create an advantage where none existed before. And they did this by not having the superior force or the superior troops or equipment or whatever, but by actually knowing their opponent and playing to their opponent's mental weaknesses. And there are many examples of this throughout history, and I won't go into it because it would be its own video and it would take forever. But I will give you one example. Not many of you may be familiar, but there was a general by the name of Hannibal Barca during the early history of the Roman Republic. And as we know, Rome ended up being one of the greatest civilizations, most powerful civilizations of all time, if not one of the most evil. But Hannibal Barca was somebody who opposed, and the Carthaginians in general were people who opposed the expansion of the Roman Empire. And no one hated the Romans more than Hannibal. However, Hannibal could not ignore the fact that the Roman legions were much more powerful on the field of battle than his own armies. And this was because the Romans had advanced military tactics and at the time equipped their troops in such ways that made it very hard for other armies to defeat them in open field. So Hannibal, knowing this, did not face his opponent in an open field. In fact, for a long time, during the Punic War, which they call it, harassed and engaged in hit-and-run tactics against the Romans. And the generals at the time who were leading the Roman expedition were taking their time and being very careful not to fall into Hannibal's trap. However, politics soon came in. The Romans got tired of waiting around and wanted Hannibal defeated, so they replaced the more careful generals with a more rash and bold general. I'm forgetting his name now, but it doesn't matter because he decided that he was going to rush in and engage Hannibal right away. Well, Hannibal knew about the change in generals, and he knew that, Roman politics was involved and that they were tired of waiting around. So he used his opponent's impatience against him. He led him into a trap, which would lead to one of the most deadly ambushes in human history at the time, and would basically lead to the entire collapse of the Roman army. Now, of course, I speak about the Battle of Cannae, which was one of the greatest Roman military defeats in history. And why were the Romans defeated? They had better troops, they had better equipment, they had better trained soldiers, etc., and better supplies. What went wrong? Well, Hannibal played to the weaknesses of the Roman army, he played to their impatience, he played to their tiredness, and most of all, he played to the enemy general's head. The enemy general wanted to please his political superiors back in Rome and wanted to win glory and wanted to do it quickly, and this is why Hannibal was able to defeat him. Hannibal is actually kind of a mastermind of mind games, and he performed several other mind games against the Roman army many times when trying to escape as they were trying to cut his army off, and as a result, succeeded many times in evading Roman forces. So Hannibal was able to do this for a long time because he understood the human mind. And this strategy and tactic has been used throughout human history, and it can also be used in Warhammer, believe it or not. you can also play to your opponent's headspace, or, play your opponent, essentially. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be exploring that a little bit and looking at the pros and cons of doing that in a game of Warhammer. So essentially, we're going to be defining what is an Eldar Mind game. We're going to be looking at playing your opponent versus playing the game. They are two different things. And we're going to be looking at the pros and cons of playing Eldar Mind games when you do play a game of 40K. So what is an Eldar Mind game? So an Eldar Mind game is essentially misleading or tricking your opponent into making a bad or non-optimal play on the tabletop. And this can be achieved in a number of ways, including forcing dilemmas onto your opponent, or what I like to call hyping, or simply using the rules of the game to create situations where your opponent doesn't have a great choice either way. Now, first we have to talk about the difference between playing your opponent versus playing the game, because they are two different things. Playing your opponent means basically getting into your opponent's head to understand what kind of plays they are prone to making and setting up traps with that knowledge in mind. So just like that example I gave you of Hannibal, knowing the enemy general was impatient and wanted glory very quickly, knowing your opponent and what they are prone to do is very important to setting up these traps. And that's what I call playing your opponent, because you're not actually using the special rules of the game to force situations upon your opponent. You are playing to your opponent's mind and what your opponent is maybe prone to doing. Maybe you know that your opponent is an impatient person, right? So maybe you know that they can't really wait and hold on to reserves that long. They want to put their reserves out there right away. So with that in mind, you can set up certain traps for them early on in the game to basically ensure that you gain the upper hand. Now, playing the game is a little different, because this is only using the rules of the game itself, not using your opponent's attributes or, whether they're impatient or not. It's not accounting for any of that. It's only accounting for the units, special rules, and things like that to force your opponents into situations where there is no good choice for them, without accounting for their personal traits. So a few examples of what we call playing your opponent. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about playing your opponent. So let's say that there's a scenario where your opponent really loves one of their units in their army and they just can't stop talking about it. Oh, I love my Terminators. They're so great. Last game, they killed 4 units of Space Marines, and they killed this and they killed that. And they just keep going on and on and on about these Terminators, right? So obviously, this player really likes those Terminators. So are we going to sit there and argue with them and say, you know what, actually, you probably just had a lucky game and all that stuff? No, right? First of all, that's kind of mean. And second of all, we can actually use this to our advantage if we're playing an Eldar Mind game, right? So what we can do is we can just jump on the hype train with them, right? Hype that unit up with them. Oh yeah, they're a really nasty unit. They can basically take out anything of mine. I better be really careful, right? And then this will open up an opportunity later in the game. Your opponent will probably overvalue that unit and overestimate that unit of theirs against you. And that can lead to an opportunity where you can take that unit out. And I have a little story to tell you about that. So there was a game where I was in the shop. I was actually in high school at the time. This was years ago. And there was another player who was talking up his unit of Tyranid Tyrant Guard, I believe it was. He had a unit, basically a Death Star at the time, of a Hive Tyrant and several Tyrant Guard. And he was saying how this unit could basically beat the brakes off of any other unit in the game, right? He was just talking up a storm about them, saying how they killed 2 units of Terminators by themselves, etc., etc. And then he turns to me and says, and they could also beat any single Eldar unit in your entire codex. Now, I happen to know at the time that a Seer Council, a full maxed out Seer Council with Fortune and all that, could probably beat that unit. Just mathematically, I knew that in my head. So I conceded that fact. I said, yeah, they probably could beat them. Do you want to play a game? And we agreed to a game. We started to play. Now, I knew at the beginning of the game that he was going to want to get his Tyrant Guard into combat with my Seer Council. I knew this. And I knew this would also probably lead him out into the open. So what I did was I deployed my Seer Council directly across from his Hive Tyrant and with his Tyrant Guard. And I just played the rest of the game. I made him believe that I was going to want to get my Seer Council into combat with his Hive Tyrant. And I said many times, man, this would be a good fight, wouldn't it? Right? Stuff like that. Friendly taunting or goading, saying, oh, this would be a great duel. Well, basically, I had 2 units of Fire Dragons in 2 other Wave Serpents waiting in the wings. And what my plan was is I was going to do the old bait and switch. I was going to move the Seer Council's Wave Serpent to the other side of the battlefield. I was going to bring up the Fire Dragons. And at the time, in this edition, you could dump them out after the Wave Serpents moved and then shoot. So that's exactly what I did. I dumped out my Fire Dragons in front of his Hive Tyrant and his Tyrant Guard. Once they were out in the open and unsupported, and I annihilated them. Now, many of you might be thinking, oh, that Proxy Hammer, you're kind of a dick. And yes, it was kind of a dick Eldar Mind game that I played on this poor guy, and I soon regretted it because he got very angry and he actually started to break his figures. Now, that wasn't something that I'm proud of, to be honest. I didn't think it would get to that point. And I place a lot of it down on being an immature high schooler that, liked playing tricks on people. But to be honest with you, that's an example of playing your opponent, right? That's an example of somebody overhyping a unit and them basically, because they think that unit is OP and really strong, overestimating it, and that could lead to a situation where they overextend or they place it into a position where they're going to be killed very easily, which is exactly what happened in that game. So the other thing is friendly taunting or goading. And that's another way to get a player to commit to a choice that is probably 9 times out of 10 a bad move. So for example, and these could be things like, hey, you want to charge that unit in, right? Things like, oh, come on, are you serious? Are you not going to charge that unit in there? Right? Stuff like that. That's taunting or goading. And it could be friendly and it could be in a friendly environment, but it could cause players to actually do it, to actually give in and say, you know what? You're right. I'm going to make that charge, right? Even maybe it's a 12-inch charge or something ridiculous like that. But because you goaded them a little bit and kind of, nudged them a little bit with your elbow and said, come on, you want to try it. What's the worst that can happen? They might actually make that decision in the game. Now, again, I think these are examples of playing your opponent, and these can work, but to be honest with you, they have a lot of downsides to them. And it's not something that I typically recommend to players in general. To be honest with you, it could lead to a lot of situations where a player can feel kind of cheated, and that's not right. So I think that in some cases, it can be kind of bad for the game, to be honest with you. It is something that can help you win, absolutely. But it's, at the end of the day, it's a game. We're not playing for empires here. The fate of our people is not at stake, right? We're just playing a game with models, figures, miniatures. So we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to make sure that not only are we having a good time, but we're also allowing our opponent to have a good time. And that means if your opponent is, extra impatient, let your opponent make those decisions on their own, right? They don't need you kind of convincing them or goading them into making those decisions. So, and honestly, I have a number of players in my gaming group who have a tendency to make risky decisions, and it doesn't always pay off, right? So let those players make those decisions on their own. They're probably going to do it anyway. You don't really need to convince them that much. So the other side of that coin is playing the game, which is totally viable, and it's one of the things that I think when you play Eldar Mind Games, you should be focused on doing this kind of Eldar Mind Game. So this is using maybe a valuable unit to forewarned bait. So basically offering up a valuable unit that can be destroyed, only destroyed, via enemy reserves that come in via deep strike or something like that. But then having another unit ready to blast them with forewarned. So for example, yes, you can tell your opponent, yeah, I have forewarned. I can shoot you if you come in reserves within 18 inches. But if your opponent sees a unit out in the open like that, they might want to risk that. They might want to risk it for that valuable unit. And if you know how much damage your forewarned unit can do to that particular enemy unit, and you know mathematically that on average rolls you should be able to kill that unit, then yeah, that's actually a great strategy to set up for, because you're not really doing anything wrong. You're telling your opponent you have the forewarned ability, but you're giving a tantalizing little bait out there for him to take. Now, your opponent can play around this, so beware of that. But if there's a situation where the only thing that can harm that baited unit is actually, units that come in via deep strike, then this is a great way to protect it and bait your opponent into making a bad play. Also, redeployment and misdirection type abilities like Phantasm are great for this, because they force an opponent to react to something that, well, you might not even still be in the same area for, right? So, for example, if your opponent sees a large amount of units on one side of the board, he's going to put a large amount of units on that side of the board to protect that side of the board. And if you use Phantasm to move those units to the other side, well, now your opponent can't do anything with those units, right? So that's another example of using the rules in the game to play a bit of an Eldar Mind Game on your opponent. And lastly, making opponents make hard choices around objectives, putting them in positions where they either have to kill the unit that you're threatening them with and not score on the objective, or score on the objective and then die afterward, right? So making your opponent make those hard choices throughout the game is another thing that is basically key to having a lot of success as Eldar. And these three things that I described here are perfectly viable ways to play, and in fact, you want to be able to play like this in certain circumstances with Eldar, because it really plays to the strengths of the faction, right? Redeployment and misdirection especially, I think, plays to the strengths of the faction, and I think it's actually very necessary for a lot of games to have that Phantasm in your back pocket, even as just a misdirection type of ability, so that your opponent doesn't always know exactly where you're going to deploy, right? So all of these three things are perfectly viable and honestly quite encouraged. So here are some of the pros and cons of playing Eldar Mind Games. So the pros are, it's very fluffy and true to the lore, right? Eldar would actually do this in the lore, and they have done it in the lore many, many times. In fact, they have played tricks on two other races to fight each other rather than fight against them, which has led to the countless millions and billions of deaths of humans as well as other alien species. But again, the Eldar don't care, because that's kind of who they are. They think that every other alien species is inferior to them, and therefore their lives don't matter. So might as well save our own lives, right? So that's kind of very true to the Eldar lore. Now, it also does allow you to do well in certain circumstances where you might have had trouble normally. Now, going back to that Tyranid example, when I told you guys that example about the Tyranid player with the Hive Tyrant and the Tyrant Guard. Now, that's an example of a situation where if I did charge my Seer Council into that unit, they actually might not have won. There was a decent chance that if I rolled kind of bad on my to-hit rolls and so forth, and my opponent rolled better than me, I could have easily lost that combat, rolled bad on the morale test, and gotten run down, which was a thing that happened back in the day in that edition. So again, there was a risk there. And yes, Seer Council probably could have done a lot of damage to it, or probably won, to be honest, but there was a chance they weren't going to win, basically. So you always want to make sure that you're always stacking the deck in your favor when you're playing Eldar, and this can definitely be helped by using certain Eldar Mind Games on your opponent to ensure favorable engagements. However, there are many cons to this. One is that, especially when you're playing your opponent, a lot of these things are considered to be BM or bad-mannered. So things that are frowned upon when playing a game of 40K. And again, I really don't like to call out players for that kind of behavior because everybody goes through different things, and I totally understand that if that's the case, then that's the case. That's what was happening. A lot of people go through things that we don't even realize sometimes, so we have to be sensitive to that. But that's not a good scenario in any case, right? Somebody breaking their models. You never want to be a part of a game where a player, an opponent, breaks their own figures because they're upset, right? And I mean, at the least of it, I mean, if you're playing against, other reasonable adults, they're not going to break their figures on you, but they might do something like not play you again, right? So you might become an enigma in the community. You might become that Eldar player, and no one wants to be that Eldar player. You want to be the good Eldar player that beats everybody. You don't want to be the Eldar player that uses too many mind tricks and mind games to make opponents feel uncomfortable. Also, the other thing to consider with this is that using these kind of tricks, especially when you're playing your opponent, you're not actually improving your skill at the game in most cases. So if an opponent has a tricky unit for Eldar to deal with, using an Eldar Mind Game to deal with that unit versus using the rules of the game to deal with that unit is not going to make you a better player in general. Because remember, against a different opponent, that might not work. So you do also have to be aware that more experienced players might not take the bait. They might not be as impulsive or make emotional decisions in games, and they might only make decisions based on the rules of the game. And many people are like this, and especially if you're going against more experienced players, they're not going to make these emotional decisions typically, and these Eldar mind tricks aren't going to work, and they can end up actually backfiring on you. So be careful about that as well. So, in conclusion, I think that playing Eldar Mind Games can be a fun way of messing with your opponent and gaining the advantage in certain situations. However, be careful because it can often lead to misunderstandings, and in some cases, it can be considered extremely bad form. So when you are playing Eldar Mind Games, make sure that it is done in the right way. Make sure that actually you are playing the game and using the special rules of your army to play those games, and lead your opponent into those specific traps. Because if you're not actually using the special rules of the game and you're just playing your opponent, that can lead to a really bad experience for your opponent. And just on the human level, I mean, hey, we're not Eldars here, okay? We're not part of the Eldari race. We're human beings. So at the end of the day, we're playing against people, human beings, right? So they're not orcs, they're not Nurgle, although sometimes by the smell you wouldn't know the difference. Just kidding. I'm all jokes here. But honestly, again, treat your opponents with respect. Even if you notice they are impatient type, let them make those decisions on their own, right? They don't need our help for that. And that way we can continue to have good games for a long time to come. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. I do plan on going more into the Eldar Mind Games as far as the actual game side of it in a future video. Not so much the, playing your opponent kind of stuff. But let me know in the comments what you think about that. And if you have any experiences yourself of these kind of situations, feel free to share them in the comments. I always think they're good for a good laugh. And also, feel free to leave a comment about what you want to see next on the channel. I'd love to hear your guys' input, as always. And yeah, that's going to be it for today. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. And have a good one, everybody. Peace out. See you later.